Here's lesson 2 in our EMT course fundamentals unit. This one is on circulation and shock. This is absolutely foundational and critical that you get this stuff down and understand it, because it builds many things that we're going to do down the road build off of this material. So this one's a little bit longer than normal. There's 2 hours of online independent prep, and then we follow it up with some stuff in the face-to-face lab session that we'll do lab 1, and then we'll repeat this stuff in other labs as we go forward. So let's get going. The content here is about circulatory system function, anatomy, and physiology. We're really working on circulation now, while there is clearly ventilation and oxygenation to consider. We're going to start with circulation. We're going to talk about shock, and we're going to mention that there are several types of shock, and then we'll treat those individually in different lessons. So this is much of an overview sort of lesson, but very, very key stuff. So, cardiovascular system has 3 main components. There is a pump, the heart. There is a system of pipes, the blood vessels, whether they be arteries or arterioles or venules or veins or capillaries. And then there's the fluid volume, which is the blood. The blood is made up of blood cells and other parts of blood. And so we have a pump, pipes, or a container. We'll sometimes call it the vascular container. Pump, pipes or container, and the volume. This is a key definition. And this will carry you through this course and deeper into pre-hospital medicine if you understand simply that shock is inadequate tissue perfusion. It is not enough circulation to the cells. What could cause that? Well, if you think of the 3 main components of the cardiovascular system, the pump, the volume, and the container, if the pump's not working because of heart damage, inadequate cardiac function, then you have pump failure. That will cause inadequate tissue perfusion. That will cause poor circulation. So it could be that the pump's not working. It could be that the pipes are not the right size. The vascular container is not the right size. Now here's a concept that you may have to think about just a little bit, because it's not intuitive and it's probably not known coming out of high school biology. But blood vessels have muscular walls under control of the neurological system. And so those muscular walls can squeeze, making the amount of space inside the pipes smaller, or those muscular walls can relax, making the amount of space inside the pipes much larger. At any given time, the pipes are not completely clamped down, and they're not completely relaxed, dilated, wide open. They're a little bit constricted, but they're not fully dilated or fully constricted. And so the size of the vascular container, the amount of space in the pipes, can change as conditions change in the system. There's also the volume. Remember, there's pump, volume, and container, so there's volume loss. If you are bleeding either internally inside your body or externally out onto the street, if you have lost blood volume, or maybe you're dehydrated, you've lost volume due to non-bleeding, such as vomiting, diarrhea, excessive sweating, lack of intake of fluids. And so if your volume is low, you're going to have inadequate circulation to the cells. If the pipes are not the right size, you're going to have inadequate circulation to the cells, inadequate tissue perfusion. Then you could also have an obstruction somewhere in the system. Maybe the pump is obstructed. Maybe there's an obstruction in the pipes, a blood clot. Maybe there's something that is kinking or twisting or compressing one of the major vessels. So you can have obstruction to flow somewhere in the system. So that's kind of the hint. The types of shock, you're going to find that there's pump problem shock, there's pipe problem shock, there's volume problem shock, and there's obstructive shock. Also, in terms of anatomy, there's 2 basic circulations. The systemic, that goes from the heart to the rest of the body, and the pulmonary, that goes from the heart over to the lungs and back. 2 divisions of the circulation, 2 circulations in the cardiovascular system. Now, the heart is the pump for each side of that system, each side of that circulation, each of those systems. The right side of the heart pumps in the pulmonary system. The right ventricle, right atrium and right ventricle, pump blood over to the lungs and get it back. The systemic system is under the control or under the is helped by the left ventricle. The left side of the heart works on the systemic system. So we have a pump for each system, left side of the heart, right side of the heart. They are co-located. They share blood supply. They share neurologic control. They share wiring. They share command and control. They share protection. They share physical space. But really, it's two pumps stuck side to side. Each of those pumps is for one of the two circulations. Some great pictures in your book that will help you with that as well as with this. You need to know about types of vessels. There are arterial vessels, and there are venous vessels, and there's capillaries that are in between. So the arterial side is from the aorta out to arteries and arterioles, and the venous side, venules to veins and vena cava. And there's great pictures in your book, diagrams you can find easily through the resource document or just standard internet searches. And we're going to work on this pathway of a red blood cell until you really, really get it down, because it's key to helping you understand a whole bunch of other concepts, a whole bunch of other disease processes that are going on with people. If you can understand how a blood cell works its way through the system and what it's supposed to be doing. So oxygen is carried on red blood cells, carried out to the tissues and cells from the lungs. And a red blood cell path is what we're looking for. So as the red blood cell leaves the heart, headed out to the cells, it comes out of the left ventricle of the heart, goes to the aorta. The aorta branches off into arteries. Those arteries branch off and become smaller into arterioles. Arterioles are simply smaller versions of arteries. And the arterioles terminate in capillaries. Capillaries are the endpoint, right next to the cells. That's where the oxygen exchange, the gas exchange occurs. And so the whole left side process, left side pathway is left ventricle to aorta, to arteries, to arterioles, to capillaries. Then the blood moves through the capillaries, past the cells, through the capillaries, and comes back toward the heart on venules. Capillaries kind of form together, and the smallest of the vessels on the venous side are called venules. They're simply tiny veins. And they become larger and larger and become veins, and the veins all dump into the vena cava. So you have the aorta, and its counterpart on the venous side is the vena cava. You have arteries, and their counterpart on the venous side are veins. You have arterioles, and their counterpart on the venous side are venules, and everything ends in capillaries. And so you're going to need to know this, and we're going to quiz and quiz and quiz on this. And so you'll need to start drawing pictures. You'll need to start making lists. You'll need to start making flashcards. You need to really delve into this material and get this stuff down pretty quick. The pulmonary circulation gets blood back from the periphery, back from the rest of the body, comes up through the vena cava and dumps into the right atrium. The right atrium then dumps, by gravity feed, it dumps blood into the right ventricle. So as the right ventricle relaxes, a valve opens up and blood flows from the right atrium down into the right ventricle, mostly by gravity. Then toward the end of that, the right atrium contracts and pumps blood into the right ventricle, stretching the right ventricle. The right ventricle likes to be stretched because then it can pump harder. So it's like pulling back on a rubber band. So the right atrium does gravity dump and then actual contracting, pumping into the right ventricle. The right ventricle stretches and then pumps to the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery then branches off into pulmonary arterioles, which get smaller and smaller and smaller and become pulmonary capillaries. And those pulmonary capillaries are encircling the tiniest microscopic air sacs in the pulmonary system at the end of the lungs, so to speak. And those are called alveoli. One of them is called an alveolus. More than one are called alveoli. If you were to start thinking of the pulmonary system as an upside-down tree, where the trachea is the trunk, then the alveoli would be the leaves. So the alveoli are surrounded by pulmonary capillaries. Those capillaries are where the gas exchange occurs with air. So carbon dioxide goes into the lungs to be exhaled. Oxygen comes in from the lungs into the bloodstream to be circulated. And then those pulmonary capillaries get bigger and bigger and form pulmonary venules on the way back toward the heart. The pulmonary venules become pulmonary vein, and the pulmonary vein dumps into the left atrium. And then you probably guessed it, the left atrium, gravity dumps into the left ventricle, and toward the end of that cycle, it has dumped a bunch of blood, then it pumps and stretches the left ventricle, and then it starts over again. The left ventricle pumps to the aorta, aorta to arteries, to arterioles, to capillaries, to back through capillaries to venules, veins, and vena cava, and it's right back to the top of the slide. So it's two circulations, and there's a pattern, and the vessels are named the same thing. But on the pulmonary side, we say pulmonary artery. On the systemic side, we just say artery. And so work on this, draw some pictures, make some lists, and start working on it. Okay, so now take a deep breath and let's talk about blood pressure. Blood pressure, the next big key concept. Blood pressure is determined by three things: how often the heart pumps, how hard it pumps with each pump, and then how constricted the blood vessels are in the pipes. How much systemic vascular resistance there is, SVR, how constricted the blood vessels are. Remember, blood vessels can constrict or they can dilate. They can get smaller or bigger. So the amount of space in the pipes can be reduced or increased. And that amount of resistance caused by the size of the pipes is the SVR. 3 parts of blood pressure. Why do you care? Well, you'll be able to assess blood pressure problems by looking at signs and symptoms, but mostly signs, and vital signs will help you determine what's going on. At the EMT level, for the most part, you're going to assess and then treat based right off your assessment. There's not a lot of diagnosis that goes on, but we're building in a foundation that will serve you well, whether you continue through EMT on further in medicine, or whether you stop and you're just an excellent EMT. There's good preparation and good foundational knowledge that's required for that. Okay, so what happens when your blood pressure drops? Well, there are sensors in your body that detect that the blood pressure is dropping. And those sensors send a message to the brain. And they say, BP's dropping. And the brain says, well, we know what to do with that. The first thing the brain uses, its absolute go-to rapid intervention strategy is to turn to the adrenal glands in the on-deck circle and say, adrenal glands, you're up. Dump adrenaline. Adrenal glands secrete adrenaline. Adrenaline, as everybody knows, causes your heart to beat faster and stronger, and it also causes the blood vessels to constrict. So adrenaline impacts blood pressure by all 3 mechanisms: how fast the heart beats, how strong the heart beats, and how constricted the blood vessels are, how much SVR we have. Here's an important definition. Compensated shock. So when we talk about shock as inadequate tissue perfusion, we don't need to know the blood pressure to know that a patient is in shock. We just need to know the blood pressure to know if they're still compensating for shock or if they have decompensated or they're no longer compensating. How do you tell that? Blood pressure. Because a patient that's in shock is going to have an increased heart rate and cool, pale, clammy skin in every case. But they may have an okay blood pressure still. They're still compensating. Or if their blood pressure drops, they're in decompensated shock. Now, we don't get all worried about extensive study into medical terminology as a standalone topic. We like to work it in. So here, an increased heart rate is called tachycardia. Tachy meaning fast, cardia meaning heart rate, tachycardia. And then we talk about vasoconstriction. Vaso meaning vessels, constriction meaning constriction. So we have tachycardia and vasoconstriction in an effort to maintain blood pressure by causing the heart to beat faster and the pipes to constrict, the space in the pipes to get smaller. And so that will cause your patient to have cool, pale, and moist skin. Why is their skin cool? When they're shocky and they have vasoconstricted, why would their skin be cool? Because there's not enough warm blood going by. Well, why would their skin be pale? Because there's not enough red blood going by. And then why is it moist? Well, I don't know. It just is. It's the way it goes. It's a reaction to decreased blood flow. But cool, pale, clammy skin tells you there's vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction is usually an attempt to compensate for a reduced blood pressure in a patient who's shocky. Decompensated shock, as I said, the BP is no longer maintaining. Now it's dropping. He's still, heart rate is still up. He's still cool, pale, and clammy. All the compensation mechanisms are still in place, but now they're just not working any longer. There's too much reduction in blood pressure. Signs and symptoms of shock, very important for you to know, and you should list these and be able to flashcard these and be able to just come into the lab knowing altered mental status, tachycardia, rapid breathing rate, and cool, pale, clammy skin. So let me try this again since I stumbled on it. Altered mental status, what's that mean? That means the patient is anxious or restless or confused. It doesn't mean he's not conscious. That's altered level of consciousness. Altered mental status means the patient is anxious or restless, scared, confused. Sometimes that's hard to tell if they're drunk. And how can you tell if they're confused because they're drunk or because they're shocky? If their blood glucose is very low or they've just been in a very traumatic event, maybe that could be contributing to it. So altered mental status is one of the first signs of low perfusion to the brain. It can also be caused by a number of things, and so it's not real specific. They may be tachycardic, which you know now is an elevated heart rate. They may have cool, pale, clammy skin, which would show you that there's vasoconstriction going on. And they may have a elevated breathing rate called tachypnea. Tachy meaning fast, just like in tachycardia. Tachy meaning fast, and then pnea means breathing. So tachypnea is the way you say that, means rapid breathing. So that's the 5 signs of shock. You would have altered mental status, tachycardia, tachypnea, cool, pale, clammy skin, and eventually reduced blood pressure, hypotension. Low, meaning hypo, meaning low, tension, meaning blood pressure, so hypotension. That's a late sign of shock. It tells you that your patient is in decompensated shock, but you already knew he was in shock because you had the other 4. That's shock assessment. Now, what about shock management? Well, we're going to lay them down, lay them flat. We don't need their legs up. We see them laying flat. Place them supine. That means laying flat on their back. So lay them down, keep them warm. Avoid taking off as many of their clothes as you can, or if you have to take them off to look and see what's going on, that's good, but put them back on. Warm blankets, warm ambulances, maintain warmth. When they're shocky, they're not able to maintain their own body temp. Oxygen's a good thing. How much? All of it. Lots of oxygen. Good thing for patients in shock. Control external bleeding as best you can, and we'll help you figure out how to do this. But right now, we want you just to be able to list it as one of the 5 treatments for shock. And then urgent transport. Paramedic assistance early on and urgent transport. Because most of the time, loss of volume is going to be managed best by stopping the internal bleeding, and that needs to happen in the hospital. Okay, and then last thing here, I told you we were going to just kind of tell you about 4 types of shock and that we're going to deal with them more completely in future lessons. So here we go. If one of the problems is with loss of volume, loss of blood volume, remember there was the pump, the volume, and the pipes. So if you lose a bunch of blood volume, whether that is actual bleeding that occurs internally in your belly or in your chest or in a femur or in your pelvis, or whether it's externally, that you drain it out on the street, whatever, you've lost volume. Maybe you've lost volume because of bleeding. Maybe you've lost it because of vomiting, diarrhea, excessive sweating. There's lots of ways to lose volume. But if your system doesn't have enough volume in it, it's not going to be able to maintain circulation. And so you're going to have inadequate tissue perfusion, which is known as shock. Hypovolemic shock is shock caused by loss of volume. Pretty straightforward. Maybe the pump's not working. Remember, there's pump, volume, and container, pump, volume, and pipes. Maybe the pump's just not working. Maybe the heart is no longer able to squeeze and pump as hard as it used to. Maybe the heart rate is incredibly low. If a guy's got a heart rate of 30 because there's something wrong with his cardiac conduction system, his cardiac rhythm is messed up, his heart's beating 30 times a minute. It ought to beat like 70 or 80 times a minute. So that's what's going on. He has pump failure. He has a cardiogenic shock because of an extremely slow heart rate. Here's a term coming up. Bradycardia, B-R-A-D-Y, cardia, bradycardia. It means slow heart rate. He could also be in cardiogenic shock from an excessively fast heart rate. When your heart's beating extremely fast, it can't fill. There's no time physically for it to fill as well. So a heart rate of 180 to 200 times a minute, instead of a heart rate of 80 to 100 times a minute, when your heart's going 2 or 3 times faster than it should, that can lead to inadequate pumping. So if the guy's pressure is bad, his perfusion is bad, he's in shock because of a cardiogenic problem, we call that cardiogenic shock. Another thing could be happening is there could be an obstruction somewhere. Maybe there's something blocking blood flow. Maybe there's a major clot in a pulmonary artery causing an obstruction to flow. Maybe there's a bunch of fluid that has built up around the heart in the pericardial sac called pericardial tamponade. Maybe that's causing an obstruction to flow. Maybe there's something called a tension pneumothorax, where there's air in the chest cavity but outside the lung, a huge air bubble that's pushing on the vena cava, keeping blood from coming back to the heart, keeping blood from coming back to the heart. Maybe there's an obstruction somewhere in the system. That's obstructive shock. Or maybe the pipes are just the wrong size. Maybe the pipes are way too dilated. Remember, they're supposed to stay a little bit constricted. They can constrict a lot more, but they can also dilate out. A possible situation there would be a person who has an allergic reaction, a severe allergic reaction called anaphylaxis. Maybe they have a bee sting allergy and they're stung by a bee. And the response that their system has is to release a whole bunch of histamine, and histamine causes vessels to dilate. And so they're in shock because of a container problem, a problem with the pipes called distributive shock. There's other kinds of other things that cause distributive shock as well. Neurogenic, where their spinal cord is no longer intact and not delivering messages to the vessels to stay constricted. And then there's sepsis, where they have a severe systemic infection, and that has caused vasodilation. So I certainly don't want you to worry about all that extra stuff. Look at the slide. What's on the slide is what we need you to know. What's on the assignment is what we need you to know. Shock can be, we could probably do 8 lessons on shock. And so we'll trickle this stuff in over the course. And when we're going to deal with allergic reactions, we'll talk about anaphylactic shock. When we're dealing with congestive heart failure, we'll talk about cardiogenic shock. And so we're not going to have this huge shock lesson that goes into every little detail. But we are, toward the end of this now, just wanted you to know that there were 4 types out there. And so kind of reviewing this whole thing, your cardiovascular system has a pump, it has a fluid volume, it has a pipe system. And when there's an obstruction in that system or a problem with one of those components, then you can end up in shock. Shock is inadequate blood flow to the cells, inadequate tissue perfusion. Signs of that are altered mental status, tachycardia, tachypnea, cool pale clammy skin, and eventually hypotension, a loss of blood pressure. Management for shock is supine position, keep them warm, give them extra oxygen, control external bleeding, and get them somewhere where internal bleeding can be controlled, rapid transport. So there's your 5. And then do work on that pathway of the red blood cell, and do think about the parts and components of the circulatory system, both the systemic and the pulmonary circulation. So do your assignment, check out the resource documents, prep on this stuff, be ready for the knowledge check, be ready to go when you hit the lab. And so that's the end of lesson 2.